It was just another ordinary day in the small town of Crestwood, or so it seemed. The sun hung high in the sky, casting a warm glow over the bustling streets. People went about their business, unaware that the day was about to take a dramatic turn, one that would leave the entire town reeling. At the center of it all was a woman named Evelyn Carter, a figure who, at first glance, seemed unassuming. She was dressed casually, her dark skin glistening under the sunlight, her demeanor calm but with a quiet intensity that hinted at something more. Little did anyone know, Evelyn wasn't just any woman. She was the newly appointed police chief, a fact that would soon send shockwaves through the community. The trouble began at a local diner, a popular spot where townsfolk gathered for coffee and gossip. Evelyn had chosen a corner booth, her eyes scanning the room with a practiced ease. She wasn't there to eat. She was there to observe. Crestwood had been grappling with a rise in petty crimes, and Evelyn was determined to get to the bottom of it. But as she sat there, sipping her coffee, a group of officers from her own department walked in. They didn't recognize her. Why would they? She hadn't officially started her role yet, and her face wasn't familiar to most of the force. What happened next would change everything. The officers, loud and brash, began to harass a young black teenager sitting at the counter. They accused him of loitering, though it was clear to everyone in the diner that he was just waiting for his order. Evelyn's jaw tightened as she watched the scene unfold. She knew this kind of behavior all too well, the abuse of power, the casual cruelty. But before she could intervene, the situation escalated. The officers turned their attention to her, mistaking her for just another bystander. "What are you looking at?" one of them sneered, his tone dripping with condescension. Evelyn remained calm, her voice steady as she replied, "I'm just observing. Is that a crime?" Her response only seemed to anger them further. They demanded her ID, accusing her of being suspicious. Evelyn complied, handing over her identification without a word. But instead of backing down, the officers grew more aggressive. They cuffed her right there in the diner, in front of everyone. The other patrons looked on in stunned silence, too afraid to speak up. Evelyn didn't resist. She knew this wasn't the time or place to reveal who she really was. But as they led her out of the diner, a small smile played on her lips. She knew something they didn't. And when the truth came out, it would hit them like a ton of bricks. The ride to the station was tense. The officers mocked her, making snide comments about her appearance and demeanor. Evelyn remained silent, her mind racing. She knew this was a pivotal moment, not just for her, but for the entire department. When they arrived at the station, the officers dragged her inside, still oblivious to her true identity. But as they processed her, something caught their attention. A name on her ID. A title. Their faces went pale, their smug confidence crumbling in an instant. The room fell silent as the realization set in. They had just arrested their new police chief. But the story doesn't end there. What happened next would test Evelyn's leadership, her resolve, and her ability to bring about real change in a town that desperately needed it. Would she use this moment to teach them a lesson, or would she dig deeper, uncovering the systemic issues that had allowed such behavior to flourish in the first place? The tension was palpable, the stakes higher than ever. And as the officers stood there, their faces a mix of shock and fear, Evelyn took a deep breath, ready to make her next move. The town of Crestwood would never be the same again. The station was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air before a storm. Evelyn sat in the cold, sterile interrogation room, her hands still cuffed, though the officers who had brought her in were now nowhere to be seen. She could hear muffled voices outside the door, panicked whispers, hurried footsteps. They had finally realized who she was, and the weight of their mistake was sinking in. But Evelyn wasn't thinking about them. Her mind was elsewhere, replaying the events that had led her to this moment. She had known Crestwood would be a challenge, but she hadn't expected it to start like this. Evelyn Carter wasn't just any police chief. She had a reputation, one that preceded her. In her previous role in a larger city, she had been known for her no-nonsense approach to policing, her commitment to justice, and her ability to clean up corrupt departments. She had taken on powerful figures, dismantled drug rings, and stood up for communities that had long been ignored. But it had come at a cost. The constant battles had worn her down, and when the opportunity to lead Crestwood's police force came up, she saw it as a chance for a fresh start. A smaller town, a quieter life. Or so she thought. Crestwood, however, was far from the idyllic haven she had imagined. Beneath its charming exterior lay a web of secrets, tensions, and systemic issues that had been festering for years. The town was divided, with a clear line between the affluent neighborhoods and the struggling ones. Crime was on the rise, and trust in the police was at an all-time low. Evelyn had known all of this when she accepted the job, but she had believed she could make a difference. Now, sitting in that interrogation room, she wondered if she had underestimated just how deep the problems ran. Outside the room, the officers were in chaos. Sergeant Mark Harris, the one who had led the arrest, was pacing back and forth, his face flushed with a mix of anger and fear. "How could we not know?" he muttered, running a hand through his thinning hair. "She's the new chief for God's sake." His partner, Officer Jake Thompson, leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. "She didn't exactly announce herself," Jake replied, though his voice lacked conviction. He was younger, newer to the force, and still idealistic enough to believe in doing the right thing. But even he couldn't deny the gravity of their mistake. The rest of the department was no better. Word had spread like wildfire, and the station was buzzing with nervous energy. Some officers were defensive, trying to justify their colleagues' actions. Others were worried, wondering what this meant for their jobs, their careers. And then there were a few who saw this as an opportunity, a chance to expose the rot that had been festering within the department for years. Among them was Officer Maria Gonzalez, a veteran cop who had been with the force for over a decade. She had seen it all: the favoritism, the cover-ups, the blatant disregard for the community they were supposed to serve. And she had been waiting for someone like Evelyn to come along. Maria was the one who finally stepped forward, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Enough," she said, her tone firm but calm. "We need to fix this. Now." The room fell silent as all eyes turned to her. "She's in there because of us. Because of our arrogance, our ignorance. If we don't handle this right, it's not just our jobs on the line. It's the trust of the entire town." Her words hung in the air, a stark reminder of what was at stake. Meanwhile, Evelyn remained in the interrogation room, her thoughts drifting to the young teenager she had seen at the diner. His face had been etched with fear, his eyes wide as the officers towered over him. She wondered where he was now, if he was safe. She wondered how many others like him had been treated the same way, their voices silenced, their dignity stripped away. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about them, about the community she had sworn to protect. The door creaked open, pulling Evelyn from her thoughts. It was Maria, her expression a mix of respect and apprehension. "Chief Carter," she began, her voice steady. "I'm Officer Gonzalez. I want to apologize for what happened. It was unacceptable, and I assure you, it doesn't represent who we are as a department." Evelyn studied her for a moment, noting the sincerity in her eyes. "Doesn't it?" she asked quietly. "Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like it does." Maria hesitated, then nodded. "You're right," she admitted. "There are problems here, big ones. But I believe you're the person who can help us fix them, if you're willing to give us a chance." Evelyn leaned back in her chair, considering her words. She had come to Crestwood to make a difference, but she hadn't expected to be thrown into the fire so quickly. Still, she couldn't deny the opportunity that lay before her. This wasn't just about holding a few officers accountable. It was about dismantling a system that had failed the very people it was meant to serve. But as she sat there, the weight of the task ahead settled on her shoulders. She knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be resistance, pushback, maybe even danger. And she couldn't do it alone. She needed allies, people within the department who were willing to stand with her, to fight for what was right. People like Maria. But even with their support, the road ahead was uncertain. The tension in the station was palpable, a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the town. Somewhere in Crestwood, the young teenager from the diner was trying to make sense of what had happened. Somewhere else, the officers who had arrested Evelyn were grappling with the consequences of their actions. And in that small, cold interrogation room, Evelyn Carter sat, her mind racing with possibilities, her resolve hardening. This was just the beginning, and the real battle was yet to come. The station was a powder keg, and Evelyn Carter was the spark. As the evening wore on, the tension only grew thicker. Officers whispered in corners, casting nervous glances toward the interrogation room where their new chief sat, her presence a silent indictment of everything wrong with the department. Outside, the town of Crestwood was oblivious to the storm, brewing within its police force. But that wouldn't last long. News had a way of spreading in small towns, especially when it involved scandal. Evelyn finally stood, her cuffs removed but the weight of the situation still pressing down on her. Maria Gonzalez had left the room, promising to gather the department for a meeting. Evelyn knew this was her moment, her chance to set the tone for what was to come. But as she stepped into the hallway, she could feel the eyes on her, some curious, some hostile. She didn't flinch. She had faced worse in her career, and she wasn't about to back down now. The meeting room was packed when she entered. Officers filled the seats, their expressions ranging from wary to outright defiant. At the front of the room stood Sergeant Mark Harris, his arms crossed, his jaw clenched. He looked like a man who had been backed into a corner, and Evelyn knew. That made him dangerous. She took her place at the front, her gaze sweeping the room. "I'm sure by now you all know who I am," she began, her voice calm but firm. "What happened today was unacceptable. But it's also an opportunity, a chance for us to take a hard look at who we are and who we want to be." The room was silent, the tension so thick it felt like you could cut it with a knife. Evelyn continued, laying out her vision for the department: accountability, transparency, and a renewed focus on serving the community. But not everyone was on board. Mark Harris was the first to speak up. "With all due respect, Chief," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm, "this isn't some big city department. We don't need you coming in here and telling us how to do our jobs." Evelyn met his gaze, unflinching. "This isn't about me," she replied. "It's about the people we serve. And if you can't see that, then maybe this isn't the right place for you." The room erupted into murmurs, some officers nodding in agreement, others shaking their heads. The divide was clear, and Evelyn knew it was only the beginning. Meanwhile, outside the station, the town of Crestwood was beginning to stir. The teenager from the diner, a boy named Malik, had gone home and told his family what had happened. His mother, a fierce woman named Janice, was furious. She had long suspected the police of targeting her son and other black kids in the neighborhood, but she had never had proof. Now, she did, and she wasn't about to let it slide. By morning, word had spread through the community, and a small group of residents had gathered outside the station, demanding answers. Evelyn saw the crowd from the window of her new office. She knew this was a critical moment. If she handled it wrong, it could escalate into something much bigger. But if she handled it right, it could be the first step toward rebuilding trust. She grabbed her jacket and headed outside, ignoring the protests from some of the officers. The crowd quieted as she approached, their eyes wary but curious. "My name is Evelyn Carter," she said, her voice carrying over the murmurs. "I'm the new police chief, and I want to hear from you." The crowd hesitated, then Janice stepped forward. "We're tired of being treated like criminals," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "Our kids can't even walk down the street without being harassed. What are you going to do about it?" Evelyn listened intently, her heart heavy but her resolve unwavering. "I can't change the past," she said, "but I can promise you this: things will be different moving forward. I need your help to make that happen." Back inside the station, the tension was far from over. Mark Harris and a few other officers were huddled in a corner, their voices low but heated. "This is a joke," Mark muttered. "She's going to ruin everything." Jake Thompson, who had been silent during the meeting, finally spoke up. "Maybe it's time for a change," he said, his voice hesitant but firm. "We can't keep doing things the same way and expect different results." Mark glared at him, but before he could respond, Maria Gonzalez stepped in. "Jake's right," she said. We've been ignoring the problems for too long. If we don't fix this now, it's only going to get worse." The group fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in, but not everyone was convinced. Some officers exchanged glances, their loyalty to the old ways still strong. As the day turned to night, the town of Crestwood remained on edge. The community was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Evelyn knew the road ahead would be difficult. She had allies, but she also had enemies, people who would do whatever it took to maintain the status quo. And then there was the matter of Malik and his family. Their trust had been broken, and it would take more than words to repair it. But Evelyn wasn't one to back down from a challenge. She had come to Crestwood to make a difference, and she wasn't about to let anything, or anyone, stand in her way. As she sat in her office that night, the weight of the day pressing down on her, she allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. This was just the beginning. The real battle was yet to come, and she was ready.